Black middle-class neighborhoods are on the decline around the country. A 2022 study from the Center for Community Progress looked at black middle-class neighborhoods in Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Cleveland. The study looked at 300 neighborhoods with healthy median income in the year 2000. By 2018, a majority of those neighborhoods had fallen into poverty. And in almost every neighborhood, black homeownership had declined, while vacancy and poverty rates had increased. A new ProPublica investigation found one reason for disappearing black communities is that towns are taking them and giving their land to predominantly white institutions. Back in 1960, the town of Newport News, Virginia, used land in a thriving black community to build Christopher Newport University. And the school continues to this day to take land. All of this is detailed in a new report called Erasing the Black Spot: How a Virginia College Expanded by Uprooting a Black Neighborhood. And this issue, it's not just happening in Virginia. The lead reporter behind this story is Brandi Kellum, and she joins me now. She's an Emmy Award-winning journalist for the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalists and for ProPublica. Brandi, welcome to the Griot. Such an important conversation to be had. I'm thinking about this Virginia school. At the time, it was a white college that was built in a black community. That was the first red flag for me. But how did the town take possession of the land?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for having me. So in the 1960s, really more like the late 1950s through the 1960s, urban renewal was very prominent in our country. And so the city was able to take this community by using eminent domain, which is a power that the government has to take property for public use. They do pay residents whose property has been seized. But again, this was something that was done legally, and they were able to justify this by saying it was needed for public use at the time, which was a all-white university that to this day still has a very small percentage of black students attending the college. So they were able to use this as a reason to take the community, even ignoring the pleas of the residents that lived there at the time, who had been there much longer than the college itself.
Wow. The people who lived on this land, you would think they'd get compensated for it. They'd get some kind of, if not reparations in the traditional sense that we mean and advocate for, but some kind of repair for what's done here. You can't just take people's stuff. That's what we're taught. What happened here?
So in this case, we know that this taking was racially motivated. There's evidence in city council minutes. There's the university officials today that we interviewed for this article admitting that it was an egregious wrong. So in the case of the Shoe Lane residents, it's widely known at this point that this was an unfair taking of a potentially thriving middle-class black community. However, in terms of the conversation about reparations, which is we're talking about a lot in this country today. It's part of the national dialogue about addressing these harms done to black communities. This case is one that is simply complicated because the residents were paid for their property, even though they were paid less than what it was worth in the 1960s. And even until the early 2000s, there were still residents living there. So those residents also lived under this fear of condemnation. And ultimately, everyone's fears in the communities came to fruition because the college now has gobbled up almost all of the community. There are only 5 houses left. And I think the underlying question of our investigation is what can be done for this community of residents who did not want to sell their land to the college. And this act was done by racial motivations.
A question that I have, and this is something that people are going to ask oftentimes when they're concerned about motivation. Was this a situation where they said, look, there's a thriving black community, let's just undercut it and destroy it and use college as a pretext? Or was it, we want to expand our land and we don't give a damn that we take other people's because they're black? How much of it was black people were just collateral damage, and how much of it was an intentional targeting of black people?
Oh, this was an intentional targeting. I mean, there were alternative sites that could have been used for this college that were cheaper and less controversial because you didn't have a large amount of Black residents living on this land. So this area was close to a all-white country club. It was in the middle of a pocket of Newport News, which was considered a thriving white utopia because there were a lot of white middle class, whites only middle class communities cropping up around this established Black neighborhood. And so obviously, based on that reporting, we can see that it was definitely targeted. The community was definitely targeted because having a Black middle class community at the time in the 1960s, during the height of the civil rights movement, where people were fighting against segregation, could be seen as a threat to that white utopia that residents who were fearing integration were trying to create.
What has the school said in response to your reporting?
So the school has not given us a response to the reporting just yet. We are waiting for a response from the school. What I can say is that, in 2019, the school did try to acknowledge this, but it was, in some eyes of the residents who live in the community, a slap in the face, because it only mentioned one member of the community, and it's a plaque that stands on an area where a house used to sit where that resident lived. But he also served as a member of the governing board of the college. So there was definitely a conflict of interest there, and the residents today don't feel like the sign really acknowledges their community as a whole, that it was just done to put a Band-Aid on what the university did in the 1960s.
I think it's important that people know that it's not just this single college. Your investigation also included the University of Pennsylvania in my hometown of Philadelphia. How often is this happening, and will this continue?
That's a great question. So we know that during the time of height of urban renewal, this was happening a lot to Black communities. I think there's a study that shows that out of the communities that were displaced, there were thousands and thousands of residents who were just relocated and spread out and scattered across the country. But this isn't something that ended in the 1960s. This playbook of universities using urban renewal to establish campuses and spread out in Black communities still continues today. You have universities that are now looking at developing research parks, and they're looking at opportunities to establish employment centers for economic development. Those are very recent cases of colleges across the country still encroaching on Black communities.
Brandi Kellum, I want to thank you for joining me. We're going to keep following this story as you continue to cover it because it's so critically important, not just to this particular town, but to Black people and really to this country as we try to find new mechanisms for justice by correcting historic wrongs, but also present wrongs. I encourage everybody to head to ProPublica and check this piece out.